start of this financial year has been beset by the same problem, the same pandemic and the same very strong headwinds that hit us last year. A second surge of COVID-19, which seems to be more infectious and spreading wider. The upside, if I could call it an upside, is that there is no nationwide stringent lockdown going into weeks and weeks like we had last year. So the country is not locked down. That is the one big plus point. But what we are seeing for sure is restrictions, and many restrictions in more and more states. So for example, going into this weekend, you're going to have at least 16 states which will be in some version of a weekend curfew, lockdown, restrictions, mini lockdown, whatever you may want to call it. The state of Maharashtra, which contributes over 15% to the GDP, is in pretty much a lockdown mode. Transportation of goods has not been stopped, but even manufacturing units have to now adhere to some guidelines which are causing smaller businesses at least to have to curtail their production capacities. Even large companies are saying that they are cutting down on some production capacities. On the other hand, what is this doing to demand? And how is this going to impact the kind of economic recovery we were seeing in India in Q3 and more importantly in Q4? Are our GDP projections going to be revised downwards? One lot of downward revisions have already started taking place. Agencies like Nomura, among others, are looking at a lower GDP forecast for this year as well as for this quarter because of the second wave. What is the kind of impact that we will see, not just on the GDP and on the big figures and the big numbers, but also on things like the ability to have income, ability to spend, ability to save and ability to grow. To speak on this, I'm joined now by Rahul Bajoria, Chief India Economist at Barclays. Upasna Bhardwaj, Senior Economist at Kotak Mahindra Bank, is on the show with us, as is Pronab Sen, former member of Planning Commission. Welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for speaking with us. Upasna Bhardwaj, let me begin with your take. Do you think, very simply put, that the second wave and the scale of infections we're seeing right now will hamper the economic recovery that India was witnessing?
Yes, you are absolutely right. Clearly, the rapidity with which the transmission is happening, it has clearly increased uncertainty as we go forward. Things were looking much more promising, let's say, until mid-March. And, and now, of course, over the last 2 to 3 weeks, things just seem to be turning more and more difficult, if I can say. Having said that, I think we need to keep certain aspects in mind. And you did mention in the beginning as well. Last year, around the same time, there was a complete standstill of activity. There was a nationwide lockdown. Now, where we stand today, there is much more awareness to an extent, while uncertainty still remains. So it is not the nationwide lockdown, but state-wise machinery which is taking a call. So restrictions are there, but it is not a complete zero on the activity. So to that extent, so that along with the fact that, we are looking at these restrictions even to be in terms of duration being shorter than what we've seen over the last 1 year. All of this together, while does point towards weakness in activity in the near term, we yet have to be more, we're not yet sure as to what will be the magnitude of the downside. So when we're looking at our GDP projections, we were already below consensus. We were at 10.5% even in the beginning of this year, and rather in the beginning of calendar year. And now we do see probably about 50 basis of a downside to that. For now, assuming that the first quarter is what will be hampered in terms of activity, and probably things will even out going ahead. But of course, this is going to be very fluid because we'll have to see how the vaccination drive picks up, availability, shortages, the entire health infrastructure. So we'll have to see as it goes. But for now, we don't see a very big downward revision to our GDP numbers.
Okay, Rahul Bajoria, what is your take? And can we just restrict this conversation? Of course, you'll talk about whether you see a downward revision to GDP numbers and to what extent. But I want to talk about this also beyond the formal economy. And are we going to see another wave of turbulence in India's very large informal economy?
So I would broadly echo most of the points that Upasna was mentioning, that this has been a big shock, again, in terms of the uncertainty it creates, right? I mean, in terms of the real indicators, whatever little information we have so far, there's very little evidence of there being a significant slowdown as far as the formal sector is concerned. But in the informal sector, there are already reports of labor shortages starting to materialize from some of the industrial areas, particularly in Maharashtra. I think typically you do see a reverse migration taking place before the sowing season begins ahead of monsoons. So again, that might be happening a little bit too early. So you could see anecdotal evidence of there being some, again, a bit of a redux of what took place last year, but on a much more smaller and more narrower scale. So I think the situation remains very fluid. It still remains to be seen what will be the overall economic impact. But then clearly we have seen discretionary activity, things like air travel numbers have started to decline. Passenger traffic, even for railways, has come down a little bit at the margin in the first couple of weeks of April. That we can see. And fuel consumption is likely to suffer as well. So as the formal activity gets impacted, I think it's a reasonable conclusion that the informal activity is also getting impaired alongside, and that has a greater human cost as far as the employment opportunities and the loss of income is concerned, which will have negative feedback loops, again, being generated through the formal sector. So clearly, the first quarter of the fiscal is starting to shape up like one where there will be some amount of economic losses. Hopefully the vaccination drive does move forward pretty smoothly, and we are able to scale up, which will help us regain some confidence, maybe to prevent a significant growth downside, at least from the baseline projections that I think most of us are working with, which is between 10 to 11%.
The vaccination drive, and let me come to Mr. Pronab Sen here. Mr. Pronab Sen, good evening. The vaccination drive was the one factor which was supposed to have boosted India's recovery, economic growth this entire year. The theory is that a large enough number of people will get vaccinated, which will help open up activity. Restaurants will open up again, people can go out again, they will travel, everything will be fine, and then the consumer demand economy will pick up. But is there a hitch in this theory now that we are seeing a fair number of reinfections post vaccination as well, and the supply chain of vaccinations seems to be fairly choked up for at least the next 3 or 4 months?
In fact, in an important sense, the decisions that were taken about vaccination were pretty much of a piece with what happened last year when the lockdown was announced, which was focus was on lives and not on livelihoods. So what we have is a situation today where people only above the age of 45 can be vaccinated. That's not where your workforce is. In fact, 45 plus workforce is actually a pretty small percentage of the main workforce in the country. So as in terms of the people who are there as far as the economy is concerned, vaccination is still a distant dream. It will maybe come 3-4 months later. So the impact, if the fear factor is high, which I suspect it is going to be because the death count is higher this time than last year, what you may see is something which could be potentially as bad as the lockdown without a lockdown. I think that's the first thing you need to keep in mind as far as the economy is concerned, not as far as saving lives is concerned. The second point is that a nationwide lockdown allowed the government to impose a moratorium on bank loans. Episodic, regionally localized lockdowns do not give you that flexibility. So if you have units who are being affected, who are unable to meet their EMIs, no moratorium is going to be happening. And so the deaths in industry are likely to be far more substantial than what we had the same time last year. So although the situation doesn't seem so bad on the face of it, I think the fine print is very, very worrying to me.
Okay, let's talk a bit more about that fine print. And Upasna, I want you to take forward the point that Dr. Sen made. Are we going to see bad loans now potentially piling up without the safety net of a moratorium that you had last time around? And especially in your smaller companies, in your MSME space, you're already seeing reports of transportation costs going up, truckers not wanting to travel, truck rentals going through the roof, truckers not wanting to travel because they don't know if they will get facilities or they're going to be stuck in the middle of night curfews. Small businesses also reporting about how their labor wants to go back to their hometowns and, you know, facing a shortage of labor. So are all of these issues going to start piling up?
See, clearly there is a risk, with as and when we're talking about economic activity coming to a standstill and the situation worsening, clearly there will be a risk for rising NPAs. That is something which I cannot deny. But having said that, I think we are still, we have the credit guarantee scheme which is ongoing, and especially given again that contact-based services and all are going to be, the recovery that we were expecting is going to be postponed or deferred for some more time now. The fact that this sector has partly been included in the ECLG scheme, that does provide a buffer to an extent. So we do push, at least I can say that in the near term, I don't see that surge in NPAs happening. There are certain buffers which are there. Whether we look at this now from a medium to long-term perspective, we will have to see how really the economy fares. So there are a lot of ifs and buts here. In the near term, I don't see this risk because there is a credit guarantee scheme for the MSMEs and the certain segments within tourism, within services, rather hospitality segment, which have been incorporated now. That does provide a cushion. So maybe near term, I don't still see that risk.
Rahul, you want to add in on that? Is there a risk now to the financial system which has re-emerged?
So I think, there will be some blowbacks, right, of the amount of, the panic that might be setting in. And I think, Dr. Sen is absolutely spot on when he says that you could, effectively have a situation that you have a, close to a full lockdown without having a lockdown because, the human behavior, the consumer behavior might turn very risk averse. And we are already seeing some of that, playing out in cities like Mumbai, in Pune. You hear anecdotal evidences of streets being completely empty, even when certain activity is allowed. So, but at the same time, I think, there is tremendous amount of liquidity which is still there in the system. The RBI, has plenty of ammunition to kind of deal with any financial contingencies. I think, it is to be seen whether, we do see a significant blowback in terms of NPAs increasing. I think the near term, focus will probably remain on the health crisis and how does that play out, and then the economic costs are going to get counted, right? So in a way, last year, the government was focused on trying to, get ahead of the economic hit, but this time around, because there is no top-down lockdown, there's not going to be any significant preemptive behavior on part of the central government, to provide relief. So and the fiscal space as far as the state governments are concerned is very, very limited, almost non-existent. So from that standpoint, I think, you could have a little bit more scarring, maybe at a localized level. We have to be watchful for that. I would still, emphasize that ultimately it is the vaccination drive which will probably help us, in reducing mortality and reducing the fear, and that will, show up in the economic numbers as well. So ultimately, I think the focus should remain, from the government's perspective on boosting the supply of vaccines and also trying to take steps to reduce vaccine hesitancy, because clearly there is, that on the rise. I mean, with more anecdotal stories of people getting, the virus after getting vaccinated. So I think reducing that fear factor and boosting the supply is ultimately what will help us in sustainably opening up the economy.
All right, Dr. Sen, I just want your take also on the impact that we're going to start seeing in employment. Now, CMI has put out very initial data from the first 2 weeks of April, where they are already seeing a drop in both the labor participation rates, labor force participation rates, as well as the overall employment numbers. Although, unlike last time, we're not seeing these widespread announcements of sackings of companies cutting costs. Do you think the impact will be more on gig workers, on informal workers, and a curb in expansion plans of hiring?
What has happened in effect is, and this is what I think what Rahul was also trying to say, is that the levels of uncertainty have gone up. They have gone up both among the employers as well as among the employees. So people may not be getting laid off at this point in time, and they're not getting laid off, at least in not large numbers. But I think companies will postpone their hiring decisions to a later point. As far as the employees are concerned, given the uncertainties which are facing them, given the experience that we had last year, you're already starting to see a lot of reverse migration happening. It's much more orderly this time because people have a heads up on what's coming. But reverse migration has started again. Now, these people are obviously coming from somewhere. They were not sitting around idle. Now, the problem with the CMI data, and we need to be very conscious of this fact, is that the CMI data has a hard time in picking up migration kind of information. It picks up very accurately the in situ population, but migration it cannot pick up. So if a person quits his job and goes back to his village, he vanishes from that sample, which is why it may not show up in their numbers. But given the uncertainty, my guess is that the employment recovery problem is going to get pushed back and get pushed back quite significantly.
Going ahead, Dr. Sen, do you see the biggest challenge right now being consumer sentiment, which had not completely revived even in, I would say, Q3 and Q4? It was showing cases of revival or signs of revival around the festive season last year, even in Q4 to some extent. Do you see consumer sentiment being hit if this persists, and is all of this contingent on how soon we overcome the second wave?
As far as consumer sentiments are concerned, at least we do have the evidence of the RBI consumer confidence surveys, and that does not make for pretty reading. I mean, it shows consumer confidence actually pretty much dropping off a cliff. So consumer sentiment is seriously down, very seriously down. The question is, does it continue to go down? Because remember, a low consumer confidence today isn't going to play out today. It's going to play out in the future as well. And so, we may be getting trapped into a situation where the feedback loop actually strengthens this. And that's what we need to be careful about.
Absolutely. Well, it's going to be tough times for the economy if we don't overcome this wave fairly quickly. What is actually hopefully going to work for us is a very quick scaling up of the vaccination program, increasing people above the age of 45, and that would be an important component, an important part of the pie as well. I want to thank all of you for joining us this evening on the India Development Debate. For all of you watching, stay safe, stay at home and mask up.